Okay, this is the second episode ever of the Daily Signal, which I guess is related to heritage. And I did learn something from this first broadcast that I've heard. Even though I know that the states are to elect the president, um, I hadn't really considered it as a safeguard against voter fraud. So this is a pretty good explanation of the Electoral College, how states elect the president, and how it prevents easy voter fraud.
The Electoral College,
Which
which
is always a fan favorite of
oh,
the Daily Signal.
of the Daily Signal, yes, definitely. Well, we ran a piece a couple weeks ago by Tara Ross, who has a new book out on the Electoral College, and this particular piece talks about how it's actually a safeguard against voter fraud. Jarrett, you've studied the Electoral College and along with a number of other constitutional issues. Tell us a little bit about why we need the Electoral College to, among other things, protect against voter fraud.
Yeah, I heard the excerpt that we had was fantastic because I think there was a lot of people making the opposite argument, saying that the Electoral College is a national security issue. There was this ridiculous article in Politico that was attacking the Electoral College and saying, look, Russians can manipulate our elections. But what Ross pointed out in her piece, which is fantastic, is that having these state by state elections to determine who becomes the president, actually makes it more difficult for fraudsters to tip an election one way or another. They would have to know specifically which states are the ones that are going to flip. As we saw with 2016, that's a difficult thing to predict. Which state are you going to target if you want to flip an election and use fraud to try to influence things? And how do you know which voters to go after? If it's a big national election, we just kind of throw all people into a pot, you can kind of target any electorate in the country. You can target any people to try to flip an election one way or another. When we have the state by state system, which is what we have with the Electoral College, it's much more difficult to pinpoint who to target, who to say, well, how do we throw some votes one way or another? Even the closest elections, these things aren't easy to predict. And so if somebody really is, there's an interested group that really wants to go out there and create mass fraud, the Electoral College kind of acts as a safeguard in our system and has been so for hundreds of years. And her book is excellent. It's called the Indispensable Electoral College. She kind of makes not just the argument for prevention of fraud and things like that, but why it's an important part of our constitutional system, why it's such a good way of electing presidents, and why it's created this very stable system that has provided our constitutional republic over 2 centuries of stable transition of power from one president to the next. Something that's ruined so many other countries. I mean, just look at the history of France in that period of time. How many republics and empires and things that they've gone through. The United States has a system of the Electoral College, which has created that peaceful transition in a very law-abiding way. The founders were quite explicit about.
Jared, I was going to ask you about the founders in the Electoral College, and of course you already beat me to the punch. Guys, if you ever have Jared at a party, he will bring up the founders, and it will be great. Anyway, please continue.
Well, the founders, they really conceived the system for us. They're very explicit. They laid out in the Constitution what the Electoral College would be, how it would be set up. Of course, the head of the DNC, Tom Perez, didn't believe that this was in the Constitution. I'm not sure why. Maybe you should study a little bit more about what's actually in it. But they did lay out this system because the founders were very worried about the transition of power. This had ruined so many republics of the past. They had learned from the experience of Rome. Rome had a series of emperors. There was no legal way to transfer power from one to another. It became arbitrary. America has this very well-defined system that has explicit laws that preserves the idea of federalism and state power that's so much a part of what America is. And it's created something it's very, I realize a lot of people don't know much about the Electoral College today, but it's very explicit in the way it's described in the Constitution. It's hard to mistake what this system is. So it's really provided stable government for us and presidential elections throughout our history that has gone on without fail, except I guess you could say the Civil War, yet we still did inaugurate
that was a
Abraham
little bit
Lincoln.
of a bump.
It was a little bit of a bump, but Lincoln was still ultimately became president. So it really has been a miraculous system over 2 centuries that has been a great thing for the United States. So if you're gonna tear something down,
it's interesting you mentioned the stability, and I believe Clinton wasn't sure if she was going to attend Trump's inauguration, even though as a president's wife that would be normal. And I believe she came under fire from some on the left for ultimately attending it, which it's a weird thing to agree with Hillary Clinton. But anyway, I don't think we're gonna get into anything horrible mob rule wise or anything, but it should not be taken for granted, the peaceful transferring of power.
Yeah, I think that's something that I try to stress when I've defended electoral college. Not just the form of it, but the fact that, look, we have peaceful transition that doesn't exist in many places in the world. So, really we should be thankful for the existence of the Electoral College and the genius of the founders for setting this up for us and preventing things like fraud and making sure that federalism exists, make sure that candidates have to appeal to voters not just in the biggest states but in the small ones too. I think this is all part of what the genius is of America.
Absolutely. Well, our